Episode 3, The Three Certainties. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Föhn, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms just how trusts actually work in real situations. I've spent more than 28 years working as a banker and fiduciary. Over that time, I've advised more than 100 families and individuals, from Polynesia to Japan, Canada to India, South Africa to the UK, as well as several hundred professional intermediaries and their companies, all looking to deepen their practical understanding of trusts and their use across multiple jurisdictions. For the last 20 years, my work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance, not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. In the first session within this first group of podcasts dealing with foundation and intent, we looked at what a trust actually is. In the second, we explored why families use trusts at all. And today, we turn to something that sounds technical, yes, even dry, but is anything but. It's called the three certainties. The three certainties are often taught as a kind of legal checklist, something to be memorized, examined, and then filed away. That approach misses the point entirely. The three certainties are not just legal requirements, they're tests of thinking. They ask whether a trust has been conceived with clarity or assembled based on hope, habit, and borrowed assumptions. You see, when trusts fail, they rarely fail because tax planning was too aggressive or structures were too clever. They fail because the thinking at the outset was muddled. The three certainties, on the other hand, expose that muddle. They do not create discipline. They reveal whether discipline was there to begin with. So part 1. Why the three certainties exist. Trusts are powerful precisely because they separate ownership from benefit. That separation is unusual. And because it's unusual, the law insists on clarity before it will recognize it. The law doesn't allow assets to simply drift into limbo. It doesn't tolerate ambiguity where responsibility is concerned. The three certainties exist to answer three deceptively simple questions. Did someone genuinely intend to create a trust? Do we know what property is subject to it? And do we know who or what it's for? Now, if any one of these questions can't be answered clearly, the trust either fails outright or becomes unstable. Sometimes that failure is immediate. More often, it emerges years later under conditions of stress. At the moment of creation, everything may appear calm. Assets are plentiful, relationships are cordial, expectations are aligned, or at least untested. It's only later when circumstances change that uncertainty reveals itself. A death, a divorce, a business failure, a regulatory inquiry, a beneficiary who challenges a decision. And that is when the certainties matter. Not because they are technical rules, but because they determine whether the trust can actually withstand pressure. Modern wealth planning hasn't made these principles obsolete. It has actually made them more important. As structures become more complex, as families become more international, and as assets become more abstract, clarity becomes harder to achieve and easier to assume. The three certainties exist to prevent assumption from masquerading as intention. It's worth emphasizing that the three certainties are not independent tests. They operate as a system. Weakness in one almost always infects the others. Where intention is unclear, subject matter often becomes blurred. Where subject matter is vague, objects are frequently drafted too broadly. Where objects are uncertain, intention is retrospectively questioned. Now, This isn't a coincidence. It actually reflects how trusts are actually conceived. Families rarely think in legal categories. They think in narratives, stories about fairness, about responsibility, and future security. It's the advisors who then attempt to translate those narratives into legal form. If the narrative itself is unresolved, the law can't correct it. In fact, it can only expose it. The three certainties therefore operate less as hurdles and more as pressure points. They test whether the underlying story makes sense when stripped of reassurance and optimism. A trust that satisfies all three certainties cleanly is usually one where the family has already done the harder work. They have confronted ambiguity early rather than postponing it. That's why experienced practitioners often sense whether a trust will work long enough before the document is finalized. They're not reading clauses, they're listening for clarity. By the time families encounter the three certainties, they often believe the hardest work is already done. Assets have been identified, advisors engaged, drafts circulated. Momentum has built. There's a kind of assumption that the remaining steps are technical rather than conceptual, that what remains is simply execution. And this is precisely when mistakes become likely. Families rarely arrive at trusts with confused assets. They arrived with confused thinking. The property is known. The people are known. What is unresolved is how authority, responsibility, and expectation will interact once everything is placed at one remove. The temptation, particularly amongst experienced advisors, is to move quickly, to translate uncertainty into drafting, to rely on precedent, to assume that clarity will emerge once the structure is in place. And I can tell you, it seldom does. The three certainties exist because trust law is not forgiving of vagueness at the level that matters most. It doesn't care that intentions were broadly aligned or that everyone knew what was meant. It requires an intention be clear enough to survive scrutiny, that subject matter be defined enough to be governed, and that objects be certain enough to anchor discretion. What is often missed is that these requirements are not imposed for legal elegance. They're imposed because without them, trusts fail expensively. Families tend to defer these questions because they feel abstract at the outset. Asking who really decides what exactly is committed and who ultimately stands to benefit feels premature when relationships are good and circumstances are stable. And sad to say, advisors sometimes reinforce this deferral, albeit unintentionally. The language of flexibility, future-proofing, and optionality is reassuring. It suggests that precision can be postponed, that the answers can be refined later. Now, trust law does not share that optimism. The certainties are not hurdles to be cleared once. They are fault lines that widen under pressure. What looks tolerably vague at the start becomes brittle over time. What feels like a healthy discretion becomes ungovernable ambiguity. What appears inclusive becomes indeterminate. This is why the certainties matter most before anything goes wrong. They force families and trustees to confront questions that otherwise remain submerged. They require discomfort early rather than conflict later. They slow the process at exactly the point where speed feels most attractive. Seen this way, the three certainties are not legal tests so much as thinking tests. They reveal whether a trust has been designed to withstand time, disagreement, and scrutiny, or merely to look somehow plausible, whilst conditions remain favorable. So as we move into each certainty, it's worth holding this in mind. The question is not whether a trust can be drafted to meet them. In fact, most can. The question is whether the people involved are prepared to live with what those certainties actually require. And this distinction explains why some trusts endure calmly and others unravel in ways that surprise everyone involved. Part 2. The certainty of intention. Now, in my opinion, certainty of intention is the most understood of the three. It's often treated as a question of wording. Did the document say trust? Was a deed executed properly? Did advisors intend it to be a trust? These questions are secondary. The real question is simpler and more uncomfortable. Did the settlor genuinely intend to divest themselves of ownership and enforce enforceable obligations on a trustee? Not in theory, not rhetorically, but in substance. And that's where many trusts begin to weaken. Modern drafting habits have made intention harder to assess, not easier. Long documents, exhaustive powers, and layered reservations of authority can create the illusion of sophistication, whilst quietly undermining intention. The more a settlor insists on retaining influence through formal mechanisms, the more difficult it becomes to argue that they genuinely intended to divest themselves of ownership. This doesn't mean that reserved power is inherently wrong. It means that they must be coherent in order to avoid it. A power that allows a settlor, for example, to remove trustees is different from one that allows them to direct distributions. A power to veto extraordinary transactions is different from a power to approve day-to-day decisions. Where these distinctions are blurred, intention becomes muddled. Courts are not inherently hostile to flexibility. They're hostile to contradiction. A trust can't coherently say at the same time, I've given this away, and I expect to control it. Certainty of intention is therefore as much about restraint as it is about expression. Knowing which powers not to keep is often more important than knowing which ones to include. Intention is not tested at the moment of signing, it's tested in behavior. Who gave instructions after settlement? Who expected access to the assets? Who treated the property as still theirs? Courts have always been clear on this point. They look past form. They look past labels. They look at how the arrangement actually operated. Problems arise when intention is blurred. Assets are transferred for convenience. Control is retained informally. Distributions are expected as of right, despite being discretionary. In those cases, the trust may exist on paper, but it doesn't exist in reality. The settlor may believe they have settled assets whilst continuing to behave as owner. The trustee may believe they are administering a trust, while in fact deferring to instructions. And the beneficiaries may believe they have entitlements, whilst in fact they hold only expectations. Everyone thinks they understand the arrangement, of course, but they're all understanding different things. It's not a drafting failure, it's a thinking failure. Certainty of intention requires something difficult: acceptance of loss of ownership. Not loss of influence, not loss of interest, but loss of ownership. Families often struggle with this because ownership has been central to their identity. They built something, they controlled it, they decided. A trust asks them to change that relationship, to move from owner to settlor, from decision maker to influencer, from authority to framework. Where that transition is resisted, intention weakens, and where intention weakens, the trust becomes fragile. When lawyers talk about certainty of intention, they usually mean words on a page. Did the settlor clearly intend to create a trust or not? But in practice, intention reveals itself long before any deed is signed. It shows up in behavior. In my book Stewardship, I wrote about the Indian Tata family. The Tata family understood intention better than almost any industrial dynasty of the 20th century. From the outset, Jamsetji Tata was clear that wealth was not an end in itself. It was a tool. Steel, power, education, science. These weren't commercial accidents. They were expressions of purpose. India needed infrastructure, skills, and confidence, and Tata wealth was to be deployed in service of that need. What matters for our purposes is this: The Tata trusts were not created because someone discovered a clever structure. They were created because the family had already answered a far more difficult question. What is this wealth for? By the time assets were settled into trust, intention was beyond doubt. Ownership had been already psychologically surrendered. Control had already been reframed as responsibility. The trusts merely formalized a reality that already existed. That's why the Tata trusts have endured across radically different political and economic regimes: colonial rule, independence, socialism, liberalization. The drafting changed, the tax environment changed, the trustees changed, but the intention did not, because it was rooted in purpose rather than preference. Now, I've seen the opposite many times. Trustees drafted with exquisite precision, but where the settlor cannot explain, in plain language, why the trust exists at all. In those cases, certainty of intention is technically present, but practically absent. And under pressure, such trusts unravel. The lesson's simple. Certainty of intention is not established by legal language alone. It's established when purpose is clear enough that the trust becomes inevitable, when the deed merely records a decision already taken in the mind and behavior of the settlor. That is when intention is real, and that is when a trust begins to work. Part 3. Intention under stress. Most failures of intention don't begin with bad faith. They begin with convenience. A trust is created with genuine resolve. The settlor understands, at least intellectually, that ownership is being given away. Trustees are appointed carefully. The early years are calm. Decisions are straightforward. Alignment is high. And in this phase, behavior appears to confirm intention. The trustees exercise discretion, the settlor offers views, those views are sensible, the trustees agree, everyone relaxes. But what follows is not reversal, but erosion. As familiarity grows, boundaries soften, conversations become more informal. Decisions are discussed before meetings rather than taken in them. Trustees begin to anticipate the settlor's preferences, not because they're instructed to, but because doing so feels efficient. Nothing about this feels improper. It feels collaborative, mature. But the problem is that intention isn't weakened by one dramatic act. It's weakened by many small adjustments that no one records and no one challenges. Trustees may tell themselves they're exercising judgment, but the range of possible outcomes narrows. Options that would surprise the settlor are no longer considered. Disagreement becomes unlikely and then unthinkable. From the outside, the trust looks stable. From the inside, authority has migrated. This is rarely noticed while conditions are favorable, but as long as decisions align with expectations, there is no pressure to test where power really sits. Stress arrives later. It may take the form of a tax change, a family dispute, or a commercial reversal. Suddenly, the decision required is not the decision the settlor would naturally make, and trustees hesitate. This hesitation is often misread. Settlors in this position feel confused. They feel that they have been transparent, cooperative, and reasonable. They don't recognize that the trust has never truly functioned independently. They experience the first real exercise of a discretion as a withdrawal of trust, rather than its fulfillment. Trustees, on the other hand, experience something different. They feel exposed. They sense, often too late, that the trust had been operating on borrowed authority, that the habits of alignment have not prepared anyone for disagreement. It's at this point that intention is reconstructed after the fact. Settlors insist they were never meant to give up this control. Trustees insist they were always independent. Beneficiaries reinterpret past distributions as promises rather than decisions. The deed hasn't changed. The intention in law is now contested. Courts confronted with these situations do not attempt to reconcile feelings. They look for evidence of how the trust actually operated, who made decisions, who deferred, who acted as if they bore risk. Where behavior contradicts stated intention, behavior prevails. This is why certainty of intention can't be secured by a single act of settlement. It must be maintained through discipline. Trustees must be willing to disagree early when the stakes are low. Settlors must tolerate outcomes they would not personally choose. Boundaries must be rehearsed before they are required. The cost of avoiding these small discomforts is paid later, in far larger currency. Trusts rarely lose certainty of intention because someone acts wrongly. They lose it because everyone acts helpfully, until helpfulness becomes control just by another name. By the time intention is tested, it's often too late to restore it without conflict. That is the danger the first certainty is designed to expose. It's worth pausing on one point that my experience has made very clear to me. Weak intention reveals itself only under stress. While markets are rising and relationships are harmonious, informal control looks harmless. Everyone's aligned. No one complains. It's only when something goes wrong that the underlying reality is exposed. A trustee refuses a distribution. A regulator asks who really controls the assets. A creditor challenges ownership. A beneficiary alleges that the trust is a sham. At that point, intention is examined retrospectively, and courts ask very uncomfortable questions. Was the settlor really prepared to give this up? Or was the trust always conditional on continued compliance with their wishes? If the latter, the trust was never as robust as it appeared. This is why certainty of intention matters so deeply. It's not about satisfying a legal doctrine. It's about creating an arrangement that can survive disagreement. Part 4. Certainty of subject matter. The second certainty concerns subject matter. What exactly is held on trust? It actually sounds obvious, right? In practice, it's often not. Certainty of subject matter is about boundaries. What's in the trust? What is not? And when something moves from one category to the other. Ambiguity can arise in many ways. Assets transferred without proper segregation, family accounts used interchangeably, loans advanced casually and never documented, future property referred to vaguely. In modern wealth planning, complexity multiplies risk. Private company shares, carried interest, deferred compensation, digital assets, family loans treated as afterthoughts. Each adds another layer of potential uncertainty. If it's unclear what belongs to the trust, well, the trustee can't administer it properly. If the trustee cannot administer it properly, beneficiaries can't enforce it. And if enforcement is uncertain, the trust loses its integrity. Certainty of subject matter is not about perfection. It's about intelligibility. Can the trustee point to the trust fund and say with confidence, "This is what I am responsible for"? If the answer is no, the trust is already compromised. So this isn't a technical quibble. Unclear subject matter leads to disputes about entitlement, disputes about responsibility, disputes about risk. And those disputes tend to arise at precisely the wrong moment. In practice, uncertainty of subject matter often arises not at creation, but over time. Assets change form. Companies are restructured, loans are refinanced, accounts are merged or closed. Each change introduces a possibility of drift. Trustees who do not actively monitor the composition of the trust fund gradually lose visibility. What was once clear becomes assumed. What was once documented becomes inferred. So this is one reason why good trust administration is inseparable from the three certainties. Certainty of subject matter is not a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing discipline. Trusts that fail under scrutiny do so because subject matter was clear at the beginning, but allowed to erode thereafter. Certainty of subject matter requires some sort of technical understanding, but in practice it fails for very human reasons. I once reviewed a trust that was incredibly drafted. The deed ran to dozens of pages, powers were balanced, discretions carefully worded. On paper, everything looked amazing. The problem was, however, far simpler. No one could say, with confidence, what the trust actually owned. Assets drifted in and out. Properties were still held personally for convenience. Investment accounts remained in the settlor's name, pending a future tidy-up that never quite happened. Loans were advanced without documentation. Dividends were taken directly, then notionally allocated later. The trust existed, but the trust fund did not. At least not really. When pressure arrived, as it always does, the structure collapsed into argument. Was that property part of the trust or not? Were those shares ever settled? Did the trustee even have authority to act? The lesson is this: certainty of subject matter is not about listing assets in a schedule. It's about discipline, about the willingness to draw a clear line between what is inside the trust and what is not. Where that line is blurred, trustees hesitate, beneficiaries dispute, and courts step in. Not because the drafting was poor, but because the trust fund was never treated as real in the first place. A trust only functions when its assets are unmistakably its own. Certainty of subject matter is often treated as the most technical of the three certainties. Schedules, valuations, ownership claims, important, but seemingly mechanical. But in practice, this is where many trusts begin to lose authority. Because when trustees are not entirely sure what the trust owns or on what terms it owns it, they behave differently. Decisions slow right down. Distributions become increasingly cautious. Responsibility becomes diffused. Not because trustees are incompetent, but because uncertainty makes judgment riskier. Now, that shift rarely stays contained. Ambiguity about assets has a habit of migrating into ambiguity about people. Where boundaries around property are soft, boundaries around benefits soften too. Trustees hesitate to say yes, but also hesitate to say no. They defer. They rely on precedent rather than principle. They partial approve. Over time, discretion becomes pattern. Beneficiaries sense this long before anyone articulates it. They notice inconsistency, they compare outcomes, they begin to test the structure, not aggressively, but inquisitively. A slightly larger request, a differently framed justification. Pressure is applied gently, but it does not need to be forceful. This is how certainty of objects begins to erode, even when the class of beneficiaries is perfectly defined. On paper, nothing has changed. The objects are still identifiable. The drafting remains sound, but in lived experience, the trust no longer feels anchored. Trustees begin to justify decisions by reference to fairness rather than purpose. Equality creeps in when discretion was intended. Historical distributions harden into expectation. The question shifts subtly from, is this within the trust purpose, to how will this look compared to last time? Once that shift occurs, the trust center of gravity moves. Weak subject matter creates defensive trusteeship. Defensive trusteeship creates reactive distributions. Reactive distributions create perceived entitlement. And perceived entitlement is the enemy of certainty of objects. That's why experienced trustees are often meticulous, even pedantic, about asset boundaries, not because precision is elegant, but because clarity at the property level preserves the authority at the human level. A trust that clearly owns what it owns can decide calmly. A trust that is unsure of its perimeter becomes anxious. Anxiety in fiduciary decision-making is contagious. So the lesson here is not that every asset must be perfectly valued at all times. It's that trustees must be confident in the trust's domain. Where that confidence exists, discretion can be exercised openly. Where it does not, discretion collapses into precedent and appeasement. So that's also why disputes about beneficiaries so often trace back to earlier asset confusion. What appears to be a human conflict is actually frequently a structural one in disguise. The three certainties don't fail independently. They fail sequentially. Intention weakens first, subject matter blurs next, and objects fracture last. By the time beneficiaries are arguing about entitlement, the real damage has usually already been done a long time before. Part 5. Subject matter and behavior. Now, there's a behavioral dimension here that's so often overlooked. Where subject matter is unclear, discipline erodes, trustees become hesitant, beneficiaries become opportunistic, settlors become interventionist. Now, no one's entirely at fault. The structure itself invites ambiguity. Clear subject matter, by contrast, imposes discipline. It forces assets to be treated differently. It creates psychological as well as legal separation. This is why families who are casual with boundaries so often struggle with trusts. They want flexibility, but resist formality. They want protection, but dislike segregation. They want clarity, but avoid documentation. Now, the law can't reconcile these contradictions. Her certainty of subject matter demands a willingness to be precise, not rigid, but precise. Part 6. Certainty of objects. The third certainty concerns objects. Who is this trust for? Again, this is often treated mechanically. Lists of names, classes defined by reference, but the real issue is intelligibility. Can the trustee determine at any given moment the fails within the class? Can the court supervise that decision if required? Overly broad classes, poorly defined categories, or internally inconsistent provisions all undermine this certainty. In discretionary trusts, flexibility is the aim. But flexibility is not vagueness. A trustee must know whom they are obliged to consider. Beneficiaries must know whether they're entitled to be considered at all. When certainties of objects is weak, discretion turns into confusion, and confusion invites challenge. This is particularly acute in modern family structures, second marriages, blended families, children from different relationships, future generations not yet born. The temptation is to include everyone, vaguely defined. That temptation often leads to instability, not because inclusion is wrong, but because clarity is absent. There's also a subtle distinction worth making. Certainty of objects is not the same as certainty of outcomes. A beneficiary does not need to know what they will receive. They just need to know whether they are within the field of consideration. Where this distinction is misunderstood, expectations inflate. Beneficiaries assume inclusion means entitlement. Trustees become defensive. Discretion is misinterpreted as favoritism. Clear objects, however, allow trustees to exercise discretion without apology. Vague objects force trustees to justify decisions that should never have required justification in the first place. This isn't a legal technicality, it's actually a really important governance issue. Certainty of objects does not require narrowness, it just requires coherence. Certainty of objects is often misunderstood as a naming exercise. Who are the beneficiaries? Are they identifiable? End of story. But in reality, certainty of objects fails not because people weren't named, but because expectations were not managed. I've seen trusts where beneficiaries were perfectly defined, yet no one understood their place. Adult children assumed equality where none was promised. Spouses assumed security where discretion was intended. Grandchildren assumed future entitlement that had never been contemplated. On paper, the objects were certain. In human terms, they were anything but. The absence was not legal clarity, but narrative clarity. No shared understanding of who the trust was really for and why. No explanation of priority, vulnerability, or responsibility. When distributions began, disappointment hardened into open grievance. Trustees were accused of favoritism. Fair process was mistaken for unfair outcome. The trust became a forum for resentment rather than governance. Certainty of objects is achieved when beneficiaries understand their position, even if they don't like it. When they know whether they are central, contingent, protected, or even peripheral. Where that understanding is missing, certainty exists only in law, not in practice, and trusts fail long before anyone reaches litigation. Part 7. Objects and family reality. Now, this is where legal doctrines intersect with human reality. Unclear objects often reflect avoidance, and by that I mean avoidance of difficult family conversations, avoidance of decisions that feel unfair, avoidance of acknowledging difference. The law doesn't create these problems, it exposes them. A trust with clear objects reflects a family that has confronted reality. A trust with vague objects, on the other hand, often reflects a family that has simply deferred it. Now, that deferral rarely lasts. Eventually, trustees are forced to interpret what was never properly defined, and beneficiaries are forced to contest what they never properly understood. Certainty of objects is not about excluding people. It's about setting expectations honestly. Part 8. What the 3 certainties reveal about thinking. Now, by the time disputes reach lawyers or even the courts, the 3 certainties are treated as legal tests, something to be proved, challenged, or defended. That's not how they function, though, in real life. For experienced trustees, the certainties operate much earlier and much more quietly. They're not used to argue, they're used to diagnose. When something about a trust feels unstable, the question is rarely, has the law been breached? It's far more often, which certainty is weakening. A sudden increase in settlor involvement usually points back to intention. A rise in cautious, defensive decision-making often traces to uncertainty about subject matter. Persistent beneficiary dissatisfaction almost always signals confusion about objects, even if the drafting is flawless. Seen this way, the certainties form a sequence, not a list. They describe how authority moves through a trust, first from the settlor to the trustees, then from assets to decisions, then from decisions to beneficiaries. When that sequence is intact, trusts feel calm. Decisions may be difficult, but they are rarely destabilizing. Disagreement does not automatically become conflict. When the sequence is disrupted, symptoms appear long before failure. Advisors often misread these symptoms. They reach for technical solutions when the problem is actually conceptual. They adjust distribution policies when intention is unclear. They revisit beneficiary classes when the real issue is asset ambiguity. They attempt to treat surface tension without addressing the structural drift. But you know what? Families do the same. They experience frustration and look for reassurance. They assume something has gone wrong recently, rather than recognizing a slow weakening that has been unfolding for years. They search for a trigger event when the real cause is cumulative. And so that's why the 3 certainties are such a powerful discipline. They force a different kind of conversation. Because instead of asking who is right, they ask, where did clarity first disappear? Instead of focusing on outcome, they focus on structure. And instead of personalizing disappointment, they locate responsibility. Trusts that endure tend to be those where trustees, advisors, and families share this mental model. They understand that certainty is not about rigidity. It's about resilience, about having enough clarity at each level to absorb disagreement without unraveling. This also explains why the certainties are unforgiving. They don't bend to sympathy. They don't adapt to convenience. They reflect the law's insistence that if you're going to separate ownership from benefit, you must do so deliberately and consistently. That insistence isn't punitive, it's protective. Without it, trusts would become mere instruments of evasion, persuasion, and disappointment. With it, they become institutions capable of carrying responsibility across time. If there's one mistake that families and advisors repeatedly make, it's the treating the certainties as hurdles to clear at the beginning, rather than standards to be maintained throughout the life of the trust. They're not entry requirements, they're load-bearing. When they hold, everything built on them becomes easier to manage. When they weaken, no amount of technical adjustment will restore stability for long. That's why understanding the three certainties properly is not an academic exercise. It's the difference between a trust that merely exists and a trust that actually works. Taken together, the three certainties form a diagnostic framework. When a trust is challenged, stalled, or disputed, the fastest way to understand why is often to revisit them. Is the disagreement really about money, or about whether the settlor ever let go? Is the conflict really about fairness, or about unclear boundaries around the trust fund? Is the litigation really about entitlement, or is it more about uncertainty over who was ever meant to benefit? Experienced trustees instinctively return to these questions. They do so not because the law demands it, but because clarity dissolves many problems before they escalate. For advisors, the three certainties are equally valuable. They provide a way of stress testing a proposed structure before it is even implemented. If an advisor struggles to explain intention clearly, define the subject matter precisely, or articulate the class of beneficiaries coherently, the trust is simply not ready. No amount of drafting can compensate for that. So, as I close this episode, what have we learned today? First, that the three certainties are not a legal checklist to memorize, but a test of thinking. They reveal whether a trust was conceived with clarity or assembled with assumption. Second point, that certainty of intention is not about wording alone. It's about whether ownership was genuinely surrendered and whether trustees are truly independent in practice, not just in theory. Intention must survive behavior, not merely survive signature. Third, that intention erodes over time, not through bad faith, but through convenience, informality, and untested alignment. Stress doesn't create weakness, it exposes it. Fourth, that certainty of subject matter is about boundaries. A trust must unmistakably own what it owns. Without clear asset segregation and discipline over time, trustees lose authority and discretion becomes defensive. Fifth, that uncertainty about assets rarely stays technical. It migrates into uncertainty about decisions and then into tension between beneficiaries. Structural ambiguity becomes human conflict. Sixth, that certainty of objects is not simply about naming beneficiaries. It's about intelligibility. Trustees must know whom they are obliged to consider, and beneficiaries must understand their place within the structure. Inclusion is not entitlement, and flexibility is not vagueness. Seventh, that the three certainties operate as a sequence. Intention transfers authority. Subject matter defines responsibility. Objects anchor discretion. Because when that sequence holds, trusts feel stable. When it fractures, however, symptoms appear long before failure. And finally, that the certainties are not entry requirements. They're load-bearing principles. They must be maintained throughout the life of the trust, not satisfied once and forgotten. In short, when a trust falters, it's rarely because the law was too rigid. it is usually because clarity was never strong enough to begin with. And that was the 3 certainties unpacked. Join me next time to unpack common trust structures. Until then, this is Alexander von der Ven.